The scrubs hung loose on her shoulders, intentionally 2 sizes too large. Laura Bennett had spent 19 months perfecting the art of disappearing inside fabric that didn't fit, inside a hospital that had no idea what walked through its corridors at 0600 hours on a Tuesday morning. The fluorescent lights hummed above her head like insects trapped in plastic, and she moved through Seattle General in Norfolk with the deliberate shuffle of someone who'd learned to be invisible, not through weakness, but through precision. Every step calculated. Every breath measured. Her hands looked soft in the clinical light, manicured and unremarkable, though underneath the cuffs of her scrubs lay surgical scars that told a very different story. Room 347 sat at the end of the east corridor, the paralyzed Army Ranger breathing through a ventilator that wheezed its mechanical rhythm every 4 seconds. His chart said his name was Sergeant Marcus Williams, but Laura knew him as something else entirely. She approached his bed and checked his vitals without ceremony, blood pressure 118/76, oxygen saturation 97%, heart rate steady at 62. The monitor beeped softly, a sound she'd learned not to hear anymore. What she noticed instead was his left forearm, the one visible above the white sheet, where her name was tattooed in military stencil font beside a date, Baghdad, April 2019. 3 years ago. Before his traumatic brain injury had stolen every memory of the night Captain Laura Bennett had carried him through enemy fire, carrying him and 11 others out of the Jolan district while bullets threw up concrete dust around her boots like rain on asphalt. She touched the ink briefly. Just a second. Her jaw clenched so finely that only someone trained to observe micro-expressions would catch it. His eyes remained unfocused on the ceiling, unaware that the woman checking his oxygen saturation was the same woman who'd saved his life when he still had full use of his legs. The trauma had taken more than his mobility. It had taken his ability to remember her. That was acceptable. Memory wasn't the mission. Finding out what in Baghdad had poisoned his nervous system, what had left him paralyzed from the thoracic spine down while his scan showed no spinal damage, no cord compression, nothing that should have been possible, that was the mission. Laura finished her documentation and moved through the corridor with the same measured pace. Other nurses nodded at her without really seeing her. She'd cultivated that effect through months of quiet competence, of asking permission before suggesting anything, of speaking softly and rarely. Of being the kind of nurse that blended into the wallpaper of the hospital like part of the infrastructure. A name on a badge, nothing more. The kind of woman that Dr. Pierce, the unit director who'd clawed his way to authority through connections rather than skill, could dismiss without a second glance. She found the supply closet during her break at 0700, right after the day's shift had begun their handoff. It wasn't really a supply closet anymore, not since she'd converted the corner shelf into something else. The 4 bags and saline bottles created a perfect visual barrier. Behind them, tucked into the gap between the wall and a case of cardiac leads, sat her locker, a small, unauthorized metal box that should have been flagged by housekeeping months ago but never had been, because Captain Laura Bennett was very good at making people not notice things. Inside, folded with military precision into a perfect triangle, lay the flag. She didn't open it fully. Just enough to see the corner of the colors, the fabric that had draped a casket in Arlington 3 years ago. Behind it sat the Bronze Star Medal, ribbon still attached, tucked into an evidence bag she'd never turned into the Pentagon. These were the pieces of her real life, the parts that contradicted everything Seattle General thought it knew about the trembling, apologetic nurse in the oversized scrubs. Her fingers touched the flag's edge, and she allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of memory, the weight of Sergeant Williams' body across her shoulders. The sound of incoming fire, a distinctive whistle before the impact. The smell of diesel and blood and her own sweat. The moment she'd realized one of her soldiers wasn't moving anymore, that she was carrying 12 out of her original unit because the 12th wasn't coming home at all. The flag represented that 12th. That was who she was really here for. The mysterious paralysis spreading through Sergeant Williams' nervous system wasn't a medical anomaly. It was exposure. Something in Baghdad, something command still couldn't classify, something that had infected him and possibly others in his unit. Her job, the real job, the one the Department of Defense had written into her classified orders, was to identify the contamination vector before it spread further. 6 months embedded. Undercover as a regular registered nurse. Find the source. Don't blow your cover. Don't get attached. The closet door opened and she closed the locker with a soft metallic click. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway, his frame blocking the light from the corridor. He was a man built more for conference rooms than for patient care, expensive watch, shirt tailored to hide the weight he'd gained, shoes that squeaked against tile in a way that made him sound more important than he was. His eyes scanned her from head to toe with a predatory assessment that lasted exactly 4 seconds too long, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd learned to be dangerous without ever learning to be competent. Still here, Bennett. His voice carried the kind of condescension that required practice. Thought you'd have quit by now like the last 3 hospitals. The accusation was fiction. She'd never worked 3 other hospitals. But he'd already constructed that narrative, had already decided who she was and why. Laura remained silent. Her jaw tightened, microscopically, just at the angle where the masseter muscle attached to the mandible, but her hand stayed steady as she closed the locker door. She maintained the posture she'd built, shoulders slightly rounded, eyes down, the physical language of deference. His smile widened when she didn't respond. People like Pierce confused silence with submission. They mistook respect for fear. He nodded once, satisfied with his dominance, and left her there in the supply closet with the smell of antiseptic and bleach coating the inside of her mouth like residue. She exhaled slowly. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song, and Laura Bennett allowed herself one moment of acknowledgement. She was the only person in this hospital who knew what was actually at stake. Sergeant Williams wasn't the only one infected. The briefing had mentioned 7 soldiers from his unit showing symptoms, 3 more flagged for observation. Whatever had happened in Baghdad, whether it was accidental exposure or deliberate contamination, it was spreading. And the reason she was here, the reason she'd left her daughter with her mother in Virginia and embedded herself into the civilian world as a regular nurse, was because her superiors at the Pentagon believed that the answer was hidden somewhere in Seattle General's patient records or medication inventory or somewhere in the gaps between what the official report said and what actually happened. Her phone would vibrate in her pocket every morning with classified briefings streamed to an app that burned the messages 5 seconds after reading. She would have exactly 6 months to identify the contamination vector. She would have to do it without raising flags with Dr. Pierce or anyone else in the hospital hierarchy. And she would have to do it while her daughter asked why Mommy had to go to the place with the sick people and when she'd be home. That was the mission. Laura returned to the floor at 0715 and found Sergeant Williams exactly where she'd left him, his paralyzed body breathing through the rhythm of mechanical ventilation, his eyes still unfocused on the ceiling. She checked his 4 lines. The peripheral line inserted in his left antecubital fossa showed no signs of infiltration, the fluid running clear into the vein at a steady rate of 125 milliliters per hour. His pupils responded appropriately to light. His Glasgow coma scale remained at 7, unchanged from the assessment at 0600. Normal vitals for an abnormal condition. Dr. Pierce passed her in the corridor at 0730, said nothing, and didn't make eye contact. That was good. Eye contact would have meant engagement. Engagement meant attention. Attention was the thing Captain Laura Bennett was designed to avoid. She moved through the rest of her shift like water, present and functional and utterly forgettable. By the time she clocked out at 1,430 hours, she'd reviewed Sergeant Williams' medical history, his medication list, his lab results, and the timeline of his decline. She'd observed the other nurses and how they avoided his room. She'd noted which doctors spent the least amount of time on his case. She'd begun the work of becoming invisible. That night, in an apartment in Norfolk that she rented under a different name, she poured 2 fingers of bourbon and pulled up the classified file on her burn phone, a device that connected to Pentagon servers through encrypted protocols that existed 3 layers beneath the standard Internet. Exposure vector, unknown. Timeline, April 15, 2019, 2,300 hours, Jolan District, Fallujah, Iraq. Contamination status, confirmed in 7 soldiers. 3 additional personnel flagged for secondary symptoms. Spread trajectory, unknown. Mission status, active. Classification level, above top secret. Your time starts now. She deleted the message and watched it burn across her screen. The morning briefing starts at 0700 in the 4th floor conference room, fluorescent lights casting everything in sterile white. 23 nursing staff sit in neat rows, coffee cups steaming, schedules in hand. Dr. Pierce stands at the front with a manila folder opened on the podium, his jaw set like a man about to deliver unwelcome news. Laura sits in the back row, third seat from the wall, hands folded on the table in front of her. Her scrubs are pressed. Her badge is clipped exactly where it should be. She looks like every other nurse here. She is nothing like any of them. Pierce's voice carries across the room with the measured authority of someone who has spent years learning how to weaponize a microphone. Before we begin our shift assignments, I need to address some staffing concerns. Some of you may have noticed Nurse Bennett working with us for the past 3 weeks. I want to be transparent about her background. He taps the folder. The sound is deliberate, sharp as a bullet casing dropping on tile. I've contacted her previous employers in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. All 3 terminated her employment within 18 months. Insubordination. Boundary violations. Inappropriate clinical decision-making. He looks up, eyes finding her in the back row. Seattle General values team players. We value respect for hierarchy. We do not value cowboys. 23 pairs of eyes rotate toward her like a synchronized movement. Laura's gaze stays fixed on the blank wall behind Pierce. Her jaw muscles tighten once, a microscopic flex that lasts exactly 1 second, and then her face settles back into granite. She does not flinch. She does not speak. The room waits, hoping she will give them something to whisper about besides the folder. She doesn't. The silence sits heavy as a body bag. Pierce nods, satisfied, and moves on to shift assignments as if he hasn't just painted a target on her back. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1,100 hours, Laura enters the staff break room on the 3rd floor. The room smells like microwaved lasagna and the kind of exhaustion that only nurses understand, a combination of antiseptic residue, stale coffee, and the faint copper undertone of blood that never quite washes out of your senses. 8 staff members are scattered around a rectangular table: Rachel from oncology nursing, Mark from the ICU, Dr. Patel's PA, 2 respiratory therapists, and 3 aides. Conversation stops the moment Laura unwraps her lunch at the corner table where she always sits. Not a beat. Not a polite pause. A hard, immediate silence that has weight. Rachel stands, sandwich in hand. I'm going to eat at my desk, she says to no one in particular. Mark follows without a word, his chair scraping backward with a sound like metal on glass. One of the respiratory therapists checks his phone. Breaks over anyway. Within 90 seconds, the room empties completely. 8 people choosing to eat in their cars, in supply closets, in hallways, anywhere but this room, anywhere but near her. Laura unwraps her sandwich with perfectly steady hands. The bread is wheat. The turkey is sliced thin. There are 3 tomato slices and 1 strip of lettuce. She takes 1 bite, chews mechanically, swallows. The sandwich tastes like nothing. The fluorescent light above her head buzzes. Once. Twice. Then settles into its rhythm. She finishes the entire sandwich. At 1,430 hours, Pierce enters room 347 without knocking. The Ranger lies in the hospital bed, his eyes half-closed from sedation, his breathing shallow and mechanical. His sister Jennifer sits in the corner chair, tissues balled in her fist, her face streaked with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been crying in short, controlled bursts for 6 hours. Laura is documenting vitals on the electronic chart, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the precision of muscle memory. O2 saturation 94%. Heart rate 58. Blood pressure 110/72. Everything charted correctly. Everything by protocol. Everything a lie. Bennett. A word. Now. Pierce's voice booms like he's calling across a parade ground, not a 12 by 14-foot hospital room. He doesn't wait for her to respond. He launches immediately, his words coming like artillery fire. I've reviewed your clinical notes from the past 72 hours. You've been questioning my sedation orders for this patient. Multiple notes asking about reducing propofol dosage. Questioning the appropriateness of palliative care. Let me be absolutely clear, Nightingale, and I want your sister to hear this too, you are a nurse. Not a physician. Not a clinician. You document. You follow orders. You perform tasks that a physician directs you to perform. You do not, and I mean do not, make clinical decisions. That requires a medical degree. A residency. Years of training. Which, last I checked, you do not possess. Jennifer flinches at his tone. Laura's pen continues moving across the keyboard. Her jaw tightens once, a fleck so small that only someone trained to read the micro-expressions of dying soldiers would notice. Her voice comes out flat and level, like she's reading from a script she learned years ago. Yes, doctor. Pierce leans closer, his presence like a tank idling in a garage, all potential violence and controlled force. Sergeant Williams here is receiving appropriate palliative care. His family understands that his injuries are catastrophic and likely permanent. If you cannot accept that clinical judgment, if you cannot accept the chain of command, then perhaps you'd be happier elsewhere. Again. Do I make myself clear? Yes, doctor. Her voice doesn't change. Her hands don't shake. He exits, his footsteps hard and deliberate on the tile floor. Jennifer sits stunned, staring at where he stood. Laura finishes her documentation, every number accurate, every note compliant, every word a brick in the wall between herself and her mission. She stands and walks to the medication cart to prepare the afternoon rounds. Behind her, Jennifer whispers, I'm so sorry he talked to you that way. Laura doesn't turn around. She says, it's fine, and means it in a way that has nothing to do with fine and everything to do with survival. At 1,600 hours, the entire nursing staff walks past the unit board where Pierce has written in red marker, Bennett, written warning, insubordination, questioning physician orders. The letters are large. The message is public. Every nurse who passes can read it. Every aide. Every resident. Every family member visiting the unit sees that message and knows which nurse to avoid. Laura walks past it at 16:03. She doesn't break stride. She doesn't look at it. Someone who didn't know any better would think she didn't even see it. Someone who didn't know any better didn't understand that not looking is the most powerful form of defiance. The supply closet on the third floor is 3 meters by 2 meters, lined with boxes of gauze, bottles of normal saline, stacks of surgical masks, and equipment that hums with quiet necessity. At 16:05, Laura closes the door behind her and presses her back against a box of sterile gloves. Her eyes close for exactly 3 seconds. Her breathing stays even. The scar on her shoulder, the one from Baghdad, from the night she'd pulled Marcus Williams through enemy fire while his blood soaked into her uniform, aches with phantom pain. She opens her eyes, touches the scar through her scrubs, and remembers why she's here. Then she leaves the closet and returns to work. But that wasn't the emergency. At 2,100 hours, Laura reviews the Ranger's lab results in the nurse's station while Pierce rounds on other patients. The printout shows what the resident and the resident supervisor have missed because they don't have her training, don't have her framework, don't have 6 years of classified briefings on biological weapon exposure. Eosinophil counts climbing, 4,200 cells per microliter. Rising. IgE levels elevated at 487 cu per liter. Rising faster. CD4 counts dropping in a pattern she'd seen in the classified reports from Baghdad, in the cells of soldiers who'd been exposed to something that shouldn't exist, something that was designed to be undetectable until the cascade started. She opens her phone and photographs the lab printout with the precision of someone who has done this before, in different rooms, under different names. She texts her handler, immunological cascade starting. Need to reduce sedation to monitor neurostatus. Patient deteriorating. The response comes in 40 seconds, maintain cover. No clinical interference. Mission parameters unchanged. She stares at the phone, jaw working, shoulders tension settling into her like a second skeleton. At 2,230 hours, Pierce appears for evening rounds, his white coat crisp, his stethoscope hung around his neck like a weapon he's learned to use. He reviews the ranger's chart with the speed of someone who isn't actually reading it, just confirming it exists. His respiratory drive is suppressed enough already. I'm increasing the propofol to 50 micrograms per kilogram. The family doesn't need to watch him suffer. Laura's voice stays level, professional, deferential, the voice of a nurse who respects the chain of command. Doctor, his respiratory drive is already compromised. Increasing sedation could trigger desaturation episodes given his current immunological profile. Pierce's head snaps toward her. The room goes very quiet. The machines keep their rhythm, but the air changes. Did I ask for your clinical opinion, Nightingale? Increase it. Now. She enters the order with steady fingers, watching the ranger's oxygen saturation edge downward on the monitor with each passing minute. 97%. 95%. 93%. By 0100 hours, she's documented 3 minor desaturation episodes in the clinical record, each one noted, each one explained, each one building a case that Pierce is either incompetent or actively harming the patient. At 0230 hours, the ranger's sister leaves for the evening, trusting the hospital staff to keep him alive. Laura sits alone in his room for 3 minutes, watching his chest rise and fall, watching the monitors count his heartbeats like a countdown clock that no one else can hear. At 0245 hours, her phone buzzes. Alert from the hospital system. Room 347. Oxygen saturation 88% and dropping. Blood pressure 96/58. Heart rate 142. The numbers that come before the cascade. The numbers that come before the code. She is 15 minutes from the hospital, sitting in her car in the parking garage of her apartment complex, her daughter asleep inside with a babysitter who costs $40 an hour and doesn't ask questions. The mission parameters are clear: maintain cover, gather evidence, don't intervene beyond her nursing duties. The protocols are iron. The rules are absolute. She makes an illegal U-turn on Chesapeake Boulevard and hits 58 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone. The rain starts to fall like applause. The rain hammered the windshield like machine gun fire as Laura's hands gripped the steering wheel at exactly 10:02, the way they taught you at Ranger School 14 years ago. Civilian driving, she'd trained herself. Smooth. Unremarkable. But the speedometer crept past 55, then 60, her jaw clenched so tight her molars ached. Room 347. Marcus Williams. The folded flag from her fallen teammate sat in her locker like a loaded weapon she'd never fire, and now Pierce's sedation orders were going to kill him before she could extract the biological evidence that proved this wasn't natural illness, it was warfare wearing scrubs. Her phone buzzed at 20:47 hours. A text from an unknown number, encrypted message from her handler, the kind that arrived once a month in the dark. She didn't look at it. Not while driving. Not while her chest was moving like she'd just sprinted 5 kilometers with a full pack. The hospital rose into view at 20:51, all sodium vapor lights and automatic sliding doors, and Laura pulled into the parking lot with the controlled precision of someone who'd learned to move like water, present but unmemorable, there but invisible. The night shift was settling in, the energy of the day staff replaced by the thinner, quieter rhythm of 11 p.m. at a regional medical center. She moved through the corridors in civilian clothes, jeans, a rain-dampened jacket over a Portland State hoodie, nothing that screamed what she actually was. The badge clipped to her waistband read Bennett, RN in the same fonts used for 100 other nurses. The lie was beautiful because it was almost true. Room 347 was on the 3rd floor, East Corridor, past the supply closet where she'd touched the scar on her shoulder and remembered Baghdad. The nurse's station glowed with the soft blue light of computer screens. She moved past without stopping, her eyes registering the monitors, Marcus's vitals still showing as stable on the central display, oxygen saturation 96%, heart rate steady at 72. But she'd been undercover long enough to read between the digital lines. Something was shifting in his body the machines hadn't caught yet. Marcus lay sleeping under a single blanket, the kind they used at Seattle General that felt like plastic-coated paper. His left arm lay outside the covers, and there it was, her name tattooed in military block-cap letters across his forearm, Bennett. The ink faded from 14 years and 100 missions and a night in Baghdad when she'd carried him through sniper fire with his blood soaking into her sleeves. He didn't remember her. The traumatic brain injury had taken the context, left only the scar tissue and the ghost of her name on his skin. She stood in the doorway without entering, letting her eyes catalogue his condition the way her training had taught her, the subtle cyanosis creeping into his nail beds despite the oxygen, the slight elevation of his chest wall, the faint wheezing audible from 6 feet away. But that wasn't the worst part. It was the labs. She moved to the computer terminal in the corner, using credentials that technically didn't belong to a floor nurse, another small violation that would add to the list of things that didn't add up about her, if anyone was paying attention. The system logged her in, Bennett, Laura. RN. Department of Defense Assignment Code 447 Whisper. The last part was supposed to be hidden, but she'd watched a hospital IT contractor miss it 3 times before she'd decided the system was secure enough. The lab results from this afternoon pulled up on the screen, and her breathing changed. Not noticeably, she was a captain in the Army Rangers, she could control her breathing while watching a building collapse, but changed nonetheless. Marcus's eosinophil count had climbed to 18%. Normal was 4 to 6%. His immunoglobulin E levels were at 487 IU/ml, more than 4 times the normal threshold. The pattern was unmistakable to someone who'd been trained to recognize the signature of biological weapons, someone who'd studied every variant of engineered anaphylactic agents developed in the past 2 decades. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't contamination from the Baghdad water supply or some natural allergen exposure. This was intentional. Deliberate. Weaponized. The evidence she'd been placed here to find was climbing through Marcus's immune system like a virus through a network, and Dr. Pierce had ordered enough sedation to mask the symptoms until his airway swelled shut and nobody noticed it happening until it was too late. She closed the labs and stepped back from the computer, her mind moving through options with the clarity that came from having already survived the worst. The handler's encrypted message glowed unread on her phone. Protocol said extract now, report the findings, let the medical chain of command deal with it. But Protocol also said Marines don't get left behind, and Protocol was written by people who'd never held someone's hand while they bled out waiting for extraction that came 6 minutes too late. The night resident, a thin man named Joe she'd seen twice, pale from too many consecutive shifts, was 3 rooms down, reviewing charts with the focus of someone who'd learned long ago to miss what they weren't trained to see. The night charge nurse was on her break, the kind of break she took every night at 2,100, exactly 52 minutes, the kind that made it possible for things to happen on this floor without immediate observation. Laura sat beside Marcus's bed and opened his chart, not the electronic version but the physical folder that held the analog notes, the observations that didn't always make it into the digital record. His vital signs from the evening shift showed the trend clearly if you knew how to read it: oxygen saturation creeping down 1% every hour, heart rate climbing incrementally, respiratory rate rising from 16 to 19 to 21 breaths per minute. The sedation Pierce had ordered was masking the body's attempt to compensate for something that was poisoning it from the inside. She checked his airway by standing close, listening without touching, the way you learned to do when you didn't want witnesses. His breathing had developed the faintest stridor, the sound of inflammation narrowing the airway, the kind of sound that started quiet and then got very loud very fast. His lips had begun to swell, barely noticeable, the kind of change you'd miss if you saw him once a shift instead of watching him for 6 months while maintaining the cover of an ordinary nurse who had ordinary skills and nothing hidden beneath the surface. Pain was information. That's what the medical officers used to say before they'd send you back out. Pain meant your body was telling you something was wrong. She was reading Marcus's pain now, written in his inflammatory markers and his climbing immune response and the pathophysiology of a biological agent that was designed to activate the body's own defenses against itself. Someone had exposed him to this. Someone had done it deliberately. And someone in this hospital, someone with access and authority and the kind of arrogance that made mistakes, had known enough to try and suppress the symptoms rather than treat the cause. The night shifted around her, minutes becoming a tunnel of focus. At 22:47, his oxygen saturation dropped to 94%. At 23:14, the stridor became audible from the hallway. At 23:41, Marcus's eyes moved beneath closed lids, his REM sleep fracturing, his body fighting the sedation and the poison simultaneously, a war happening inside him while the machines registered only the margins. Laura stood at the foot of his bed and made a choice that would end her assignment and activate protocols that had been waiting in standby for 6 months. She walked to the medication room and pulled the reversal agent, flumazenil, drawing up 0.2 milligrams into a syringe with the kind of precision that came from having done this in field tents in the dark with incoming fire close enough to feel the percussion. She administered it through his foreline, watching his pupils dilate as the sedation began to lift, watching his respiratory rate climb as his consciousness clawed back toward the surface. His eyes opened at 0001 hours. Just opened, no confusion, no grogginess, only the absolute clarity of a man coming back from chemical restraint. He looked directly at her, and his voice came hoarse but distinct, status. Not where am I or what happened or any of the 1,000 confused responses a paralyzed patient should have given. Just that single word, military precision, soldier to soldier, which meant his training was deeper than his injury, which meant he was starting to remember what his brain damage had stolen, which meant the biological agent was doing exactly what it was designed to do, unlock something that had been locked away. Listen carefully, Laura said, her voice dropping to the tone she only used in the dark, the voice that belonged to Captain Bennett, not Nurse Bennett. You're being poisoned. The exposure in Baghdad wasn't accidental. I was embedded to find the evidence, which I just did. In approximately 4 minutes, Dr. Pierce will be notified that you're awake. In approximately 8 minutes, he'll come to this room with orders to resedate you. We need to move. Marcus tried to move his legs. His face didn't change when nothing happened. Can't walk. I know. She was already moving, already calculating angles and weight distribution and whether the fire escape was closer than the main stairwell. But you can hold on. And I can move fast enough for both of us. The monitors began to alarm at 0003, oxygen saturation dropping faster now that he was conscious, his body no longer suppressed by the drug, the anaphylactic cascade accelerating into the red zone. Laura hit the call button once, the standard signal, the one that would bring the night nurse but not the rapid response team, the one that would trigger protocol without raising alarms that would bring Pierce. 30 seconds. That's all it took for everything to change. The alarm screamed at 0258 hours. Laura's car screeched into the Seattle General Emergency Bay, tires smoking, and she was out before the engine died. The night security guard at the entrance recognized the look on her face, the same look soldiers wore when their brothers went down, and stepped aside without a word. She moved past him like water finding its path, taking the stairs 2 at a time, her civilian clothes making her invisible to the staff who wouldn't think to stop just a visitor running toward trauma. The monitor in room 347 was shrieking. High-pitched, frantic, the sound of a heart rate climbing past 160 and oxygen saturation plummeting like an elevator with cut cables. Through the window, she saw him, Marcus Williams, the ranger, his neck muscles straining against something invisible, his mouth open and working but no air moving, his eyes rolling back with the animal panic of a man drowning on dry land. Dr. Pierce stood at the bedside in his white coat, fumbling with an intubation kit, his hands trembling visibly as he tried to thread the endotracheal tube down the ranger's throat. Once. Missed. He tried again, his jaw clenched, sweat beading his forehead. The monitor screamed higher. 88, 82. 75, the oxygen saturation numbers dropping like a countdown to death. Get out of the way. Laura's voice came out quiet, flat, the voice of someone who'd said this before over the rotor wash of a Black Hawk landing zone. She was already moving, scrubs materializing in her hands from a supply cart she'd passed, muscle memory pulling her forward like she was still in the 160th SAW, still the combat medic with call sign Phantom who didn't ask questions, she just moved. Pierce's head snapped up. "This is my patient." "You're suspended, Bennett." She shouldered past him. The ranger's airway was closing. Anaphylaxis, probably, the same engineered mycotoxin that had destroyed his legs was now attacking his throat, swelling it shut with the precision of a designed weapon. She didn't have time for procedure. She didn't have time for licenses. She grabbed a 14-gauge scalpel from the tray with the certainty of hands that had done this in the dark, in the rain, with mortars landing 30 meters away. The ranger's neck was exposed, his skin pale and clammy, and she found the spot between his cricoid and thyroid cartilage the way a pilot finds the runway, not with thought but with the part of the brain that never forgot. The scalpel cut clean. One motion. The breath that came out wasn't a human sound, it was the hiss of air escaping a punctured tire, desperate and raw. She had the pen barrel ready, the one she'd grabbed from the nurse's station 3 seconds earlier, and she inserted it into the opening she'd made, threading it through the cricothyroid membrane with the precision of a surgeon who'd done this under fire. The ranger gasped. His lungs expanded. Air moved. The monitor steadied. 74, 78. 82, climbing. Get me a 4.0 endotracheal tube. Tape. Now. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. A resident moved without thinking. Pierce's face had gone the color of wet concrete. She secured the tube with hands steady as a surgical laser, the kind of steady that only came from having done this when your own blood was running down your ribs, when the weight of 12 soldiers depended on your hands not shaking. The monitor climbed, 88. 92, 95. Sinus rhythm returning, the cardiac signature of a man who was going to live. The room went dead silent except for the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, the wheeze of oxygen being pushed into lungs that 15 seconds ago had been sealed shut. Dr. Pierce stared at her. Not with gratitude. With something colder. Recognition, maybe. Or suspicion. His eyes moved from her hands, the wrong kind of steady for a civilian nurse, to her face, where the mask had slipped just enough for him to see what was underneath. He took a step back, and when he spoke, his voice came out low and dangerous. You just performed a surgical procedure without a license. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket. Security. I want her arrested. Trespassing, practicing medicine without credentials, everything. Laura stepped back, her hands already raised, her eyes locking with Jennifer's, the ranger's sister, who'd been sleeping in the chair and had watched the whole thing unfold with tears streaming down her face. Jennifer's mouth was open. She was trying to say something, but no words were coming. I know, Laura said quietly. Her composure had returned, settled like a cold fog. I know exactly what I just did, Doctor. The security guards came 14 minutes later. They didn't look happy about it. One of them, a man named Rodriguez who'd recognized her intensity on dozens of nights, wouldn't meet her eyes as he walked her to the nurse's station. Pierce was already making calls. She could hear his voice from the hallway, sharp and commanding. Yes, I need to speak with the board chair. It's Dr. Pierce. There's been a credentialing violation that's going to require immediate legal consultation. 8 phone calls in 90 minutes. That's what the security footage would later show. 3 to board members whose names were embossed on polished wood on the 4th floor, men who owed Pierce favors from the contract negotiations when he'd gotten appointed director. 2 to the references she'd listed, the CIA front companies that operated as shell firms for deep cover operatives, and those calls lasted exactly as long as it took for the handlers to recognize the situation and give responses so tepid they might as well have been hostile. 1 to the state licensing board. 1 to hospital legal. 1 to a private investigator he'd used before, a man named Carver who specialized in finding dirt. By 0800, investigator Chen had arrived. She was severe in the way of someone who'd spent 20 years not believing a single word anyone told her. She pulled every chart Laura had touched in 6 months, spread them across a conference room table, and Pierce hovered behind her shoulder like a surgeon watching for mistakes. "Notice the pattern," Pierce said, pointing with a manicured finger. "Consistently exceeding scope of practice. She's altered medications without orders. She's questioned my clinical judgment in front of patients. This is a liability nightmare." Chen nodded, making notes. She didn't ask Laura to defend herself. She didn't need to. The investigation was a formality. Pierce had already won. By 1000, Laura sat in the director's office while HR read from a form with the kind of voice people used when they'd already decided your ending. Pending investigation into unauthorized medical procedures and credential verification irregularities. The words felt like bullets, each one hitting center mass. You're suspended effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker to collect personal items. Her locker contained a folded flag, the one from her fallen teammate in Baghdad, the one piece of her real life she'd allowed into this cover. She unfolded it once, just once, her fingers touching the fabric that smelled like dust and kerosene and the ghost of who she'd been when she could openly mourn. Then she folded it again, precise and tight, the way the honor guard had shown her, and slipped it into her civilian bag while staff members watched from doorways. Some looked at her with pity. Most with relief that the strange, intense nurse was finally gone. Her phone buzzed at 1015. The text came from a number that didn't exist in any phone book. Extraction denied. Cover compromised. Mission scrubbed. Biological agent unidentified. 12 soldiers at risk. She sat in her car for 20 minutes. Just Saturday. The engine running but the car not moving. The parking lot around her filling with morning shift workers heading toward their normal days, toward lives where nobody was waiting in rooms for them to save them, where nobody's survival depended on their next decision. At 14:45, she walked into her kitchen still wearing her scrubs. They smelled like antiseptic and the copper iron tang of blood that wouldn't come out in a normal wash. Emma looked up from her coloring book with the confusion only a 7-year-old could achieve when the rules changed without warning. "Mommy, why are you home?" "It's not dinner time." Laura tried to answer. Her throat closed. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd reviewed intelligence briefings disguised as medical journals, where she'd memorized the dossier on Marcus Williams while pretending to check her daughter's homework, and for the first time in 6 months, the tears came. Not from sadness. From the weight of it. The physics of holding yourself together for that long and then, in one moment when you chose to save a life instead of complete a mission, watching everything collapse. Emma's small hands touched her arm, and Laura had no answer for the question that followed. "Mommy, what's wrong?" She pulled her daughter close and let herself break, just for a moment, in the only place she was allowed. But that wasn't the worst part. 24 hours later, everything changed again. Within 6 hours of that cricothyrotomy, Dr. Pierce's phone was pressed against his ear like a weapon. The hospital board chairman answered on the second ring. They always did for Pierce, because Pierce had leverage, or at least he believed he did. His voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man who'd learned early that confidence could substitute for competence. "We have a serious problem," he said, each word calibrated for maximum concern. "A nurse on my unit, Laura Bennett, just performed an invasive procedure without authorization. Scalpel to the throat. Textbook insubordination. I'm concerned about her stability, her licensing history, her fitness for duty." The chairman listened. Pierce knew he would. What Pierce didn't know was that the FBI had been listening too, recording every call from his hospital extension for the past 72 hours. By 0900 that morning, Pierce had called for board members. By 1000, he'd activated his network at the State Nursing Board. By 1100, he was placing calls to the intelligence community contractors where Laura's references were supposedly held, the CIA front companies that had been coached months earlier to give exactly the responses that would raise suspicion while protecting her cover. One reference contact, a woman who'd been briefed for this exact moment, said Laura's employment record was inconsistent with our current hiring standards. Another said there were gaps in documentation that concerned us at the time. Nothing illegal. Nothing specific. Just enough ambiguity to poison the well. Pierce was thorough. Pierce was strategic. Pierce was a man with something to prove, and nothing motivated a small man like the chance to destroy someone who made him feel smaller. By noon, a hospital investigator named Harold Chen arrived in the personnel office with a laptop and a stack of authorization forms. He'd been sent by the hospital's legal department, triggered not by patient safety concerns but by Dr. Pierce's carefully orchestrated paper trail. Chen was methodical, professional, and utterly unaware that he was being weaponized. He began reviewing every chart Laura had touched in the past 6 months. 247 patient records. 53 of them contained notes in Laura's handwriting that would look, to an untrained eye, like she'd exceeded her scope of practice. Most were routine nursing observations. But taken out of context, arranged in a particular order, they told a story Pierce had carefully constructed. A story of a nurse who questioned orders. Who made independent decisions? Who didn't know her place? The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that existed only in hospital hallways, that sound that made even innocent people feel guilty. Laura was escorted from the hospital at 1,247 hours by 2 security officers who wouldn't meet her eyes. She wasn't the first person they'd walked out, but something about her stillness made them uncomfortable. One of them, a man named Garrett who'd seen her save a patient's life in the ER 3 weeks earlier, actually apologized. "I'm just doing my job," he said. Laura's response was a single nod. No anger. No defense. Just acceptance, the way soldiers accept orders they don't like. She held the suspension notice in her hand like it weighed 1,000 pounds, though it was just paper. The rain in the parking lot came down in sheets, the kind of Norfolk rain that felt personal, deliberate, like it was punishing something specific. Her scrubs were soaked by the time she reached her car. At 13:04, a text arrived on a burner phone she kept in the glove compartment. From her handler. For words, extraction denied, cover compromised, mission scrubbed. She sat in the driver's seat with the rain hammering the windshield and understood what that meant. She'd blown a 6-month undercover operation to save one man's life. She'd exposed training that no civilian nurse should possess. She'd chosen humanity over protocol. And now she was on her own. Her daughter Emma was 7 years old and had a key to the apartment. Laura found her sitting at the kitchen table at 1,503 hours, swinging her legs, eating cereal from a bowl and watching the doorway. Emma's small face shifted when she saw her mother's scrubs dripping wet, her hair matted, her eyes carrying something that wasn't quite tears but existed in that same territory. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma asked. Her voice was the sound of a child who'd learned that early dismissals from work meant something was wrong. Laura sat down across from her daughter, her hand steady on the table, her voice level. "I had to leave the hospital today, sweetheart." "Did you get fired?" Emma asked with the brutal directness of children. Laura's jaw tightened for just a moment. Then it released. Something like that. She couldn't tell her daughter that she was a captain in the army, that she'd served 3 tours in Baghdad, that she carried classified intelligence about biological weapons. She couldn't explain that sometimes choosing to save a life meant losing everything else. So she just sat there, wet scrubs clinging to her skin, and let her daughter take her hand. But that wasn't the worst part. Because Laura Bennett had been trained to operate in the worst parts. And at 18:47 hours that evening, while Emma slept and her handler's rejection still burned in her pocket, Laura made a decision that would end Dr. Pierce's career and resurrect her own. She called in a favor to the night shift charge nurse. She requested access to one room on the 4th floor. And at 00:23 hours, wearing clothes that weren't scrubs, carrying nothing but her military-grade composure, she returned to Seattle General through a staff entrance that nobody was watching. Room 347 was dark except for the cardiac monitor, whose screen cast everything in grayscale. The ranger lay motionless, his breathing still supported by the ventilator Laura had bought him with her own blood. She didn't touch him. She just stood in the doorway and watched him sleep, this man whose name was tattooed on his forearm from a night in Baghdad when she'd carried him through enemy fire, this man whose brain had forgotten her face but whose body had kept her alive in 1,000 moments since. She watched for 3 hours. She watched his O2 saturation climb back to normal. She watched his pain scores decrease now that Pierce's sedation orders had been reversed. She watched a man she'd already saved twice return to something resembling humanity. At 0317 hours, his eyes began to move beneath closed lids. REM sleep. The kind of sleep where the brain processes, organizes, remembers. Laura had trained in neuropsychology alongside her medical training. She knew what was happening in there. His synapses were rebuilding connections. His traumatic brain injury was healing, one synapse at a time. At 0349 hours, Sergeant David Williams opened his eyes. Not sudden. Not violent. Just a slow return to consciousness, the way someone wakes from a nightmare and recognizes the room they're in. He saw Laura standing in his doorway first. Just her silhouette against the hallway light. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then his cracked lips moved. His voice was barely a whisper, but in that room, it carried like a command across an entire battlefield, Phantom. The code word. The operational identifier from Baghdad. The name of the woman who'd pulled him from the rubble of a collapsed compound, who'd performed a field thoracotomy with a combat knife, who'd kept him alive for the 72-hour extraction window. His traumatic brain injury hadn't stolen her memory. It had just locked it away, somewhere in the deep architecture of his mind where the body's survival instinct lived, waiting for the moment when his brain healed enough to retrieve it. Laura's hand found the door frame. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the full weight of her rank. "Welcome back, Sergeant. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.